this video, I'm going to be going over a few other elements of diagramming sentences. We're going to start with indirect objects, which is an element that you'll learn after learning about direct objects. In level 6, it's taught in lesson 35, and in level 7, it's taught in lesson 34. When you have an indirect object, it's going to be diagrammed underneath the simple predicate. It's always underneath the verb. And you put an X on this sort of angled line, and then the indirect object on a horizontal line. Now you can only have an indirect object if you first have a direct object. So if your sentence does not have a direct object, it also does not have an indirect object. And not all sentences that have direct objects will have an indirect object. Let's look at this first sentence. Pope Leo III gave Charlemagne the crown. Always, as we've discussed in the past, diagram your simple subject and simple predicate first. In this case, the verb is gave. And we ask who gave. In this case, it would be Pope Leo III. That is his name, so it all goes on one part of the line. We don't add any adjectives underneath it. His name is Pope Leo III. It all goes together. Then we see if there's a direct object. Pope Leo III gave what? He didn't give Charlemagne. He didn't give Charlemagne to someone. He gave a crown. So crown is our direct object. Then to see if there's an indirect object, you see if there's something that tells to whom or to what or for whom or for what that thing was done. So the direct object is crown. We see he gave the crown to Charlemagne. The indirect object, in this case Charlemagne, is always located between the verb and the direct object. And then it is diagrammed underneath the verb with an X in parentheses on this line, and Charlemagne, the indirect object, on the horizontal line. Now, understanding why is often helpful for remembering how to diagram these. If you think about an indirect object like a prepositional phrase with the implied word to or for, you'll see that's why we put this X in parentheses. So if the sentence had instead said, Pope Leo III gave the crown to Charlemagne, we have a prepositional phrase, and we would have had to on our angled line and Charlemagne on the horizontal line. But instead it leaves that out and puts the indirect object between the verb and the direct object. He gave Charlemagne the crown. So we diagram it just like this. Let's look at another sentence that has an indirect object. The coach awarded the best player a prize. So first, again, we find the verb, in this case, awarded. And then we see who awarded, who was doing this action. That would be the coach. And then we see what he awarded. He was awarding a prize. That is what he gave. He gave a prize. He didn't award a player to somebody. He awarded a prize. He awarded the prize to the best player. Now, indirect objects are objects. They are nouns. So we only put the noun on that horizontal line. We begin with the X on the angled line, and then the indirect object player on the horizontal line. Now we're going to add our adjectives. Underneath coach, the is describing it, this the right here. And then underneath player, we have it was the player and it was a best player. So the and best are both adjectives describing the player, and a describes the prize. So any noun, subjects, direct objects, indirect objects, can all have adjectives, and you simply add those adjectives underneath the word they're describing. Let's look at one more sentence with an indirect object. The children bought their parents gifts from the gift shop. In this case, we look for our verb, which is bought. That is the action that happened in the sentence. And then we ask, who bought their parents gifts from the gift shop? That would be children, our subject. And then we see if there is a direct object. They bought what? They bought gifts. Then we see if it tells us who they bought them for. bought their parents gifts. Bought gifts for whom? For their parents. But remember, it has it without having that word for, and it's located between the verb and the direct object. So here underneath bought, we put an X in parentheses representing that implied word to or for, and parents on the horizontal line. Now we add in all our adjectives. This first the here, describes the children. Then we have their, tells you whose parents. It's describing the parents. Then from the gift shop is a prepositional phrase. It's telling you what kind of gifts they were. They were gifts that came from the gift shop. So we put from underneath gifts. And then shop would be our object of the preposition, the end of our phrase. And the describes the shop. And gift tells us what kind of shop. And that's how you add indirect objects to your diagram. Now the next page we're going to go over is adding compound parts. That's when you have more than one subject or more than one verb or more than one direct object. Anything that is equal can be compound. So 2 subjects, 2 indirect objects, 2 adjectives. But you can't combine and have a compound subject with a verb. It's going to combine equal items. This is taught in level 6 in lessons 38 and 39 and in level 7 in lesson 37 and 38. Here is just a demonstration of what it's going to look like, but you can have other elements that are compound. You could have any number of them. You could have 5 simple predicates. This just gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. So where we had a single line before, if we have more than one of something, we simply divide it into parallel lines. Let's look at this first example. The Romans built roads, amphitheaters, and aqueducts. First, we look for the verb, but we make sure there's only one. In this case, we have the word built. The Romans, it doesn't say, did anything else in this sentence, so we only have one verb, built, and then only one subject, Romans. Romans built. And over here indicates we have more than one of something, some compound parts. In this case, the and is connecting the roads, the amphitheaters, and the aqueducts. Those, in this case, are all direct objects. It tells us what the Romans built. They built these 3 different things. So we're going to add our direct object line, but instead of writing this all the way across, we're going to stop the line early and divide it into 3 segments, 1 for each direct object. We add a dotted line here to connect all of them together, and in this little triangle is where you're going to write your conjunction, in this case, and. There's a lot of different conjunctions, and is one of the most common, but or, nor, those words are also conjunctions as well. And then we list each of our words on a separate line in the same order they appeared in the sentence. Roads, amphitheaters, aqueducts. Okay. We do not connect them back together over on this side. We just leave it like that. We've got our 3 direct objects. And then don't forget to add in any other words like your adjectives that go underneath nouns. Now let's look at a sentence that has a different kind of conjunction. This and is known as a coordinating conjunction. There are also conjunctions called correlative conjunctions. Correlative conjunctions come in 2 parts, but function the same way. In this case, we have not only, but also is one of our correlative conjunctions. You can also have both and. Up here it could have said, if there were only 2 things listed, the Romans built both roads and amphitheaters. Those are another kind of conjunction. They're diagrammed very similarly. So if we were to diagram this sentence, we look for our verb. Shakespeare not only wrote plays, but also composed sonnets. You'll see that Shakespeare did 2 different things. He wrote and he composed to create something. So we're going to have 2 verbs. We only have one subject, Shakespeare. Shakespeare is our subject on the left. But we have more than one verb. He both wrote and composed. And then in this case, a correlative conjunction always has two halves. In this case, it's not only and but also. You're going to put each of those in a separate spot to give room for them both. We put not only above the line, but also under the line to show that we have a correlative conjunction. Now let's look at these remaining words. Plays and sonnets. If we look closely, we see he wrote plays and he composed sonnets. That means that each of those verbs has their own direct object. He wrote what? He wrote plays. So plays is a direct object for the verb wrote. He composed what? He composed sonnets. So sonnets is the direct object for the verb composed. And then in the sentence, we don't have any adjectives or prepositional phrases to add. So you can see how everything works together. You can have direct objects, indirect objects, even as you have these compound elements. Now let's look at one more. This sentence said, the boys and girls wrote and recited poetry. You'll notice we have two conjunctions. And is used twice, so we have two different elements that are compound. We have a compound subject, boys and girls, and a compound verb, wrote and recited. So we're going to have multiple places where we separate our lines and join them back together. If we have two subjects, they're going to begin over here, boys, girls, and then we have to join them back together. And we use our same line to divide our subject from our predicate that goes all the way through. Then we have both of those groups are doing two different actions. So we separate it again because there are two action verbs, wrote and recited. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add my conjunctions next. We add the word and twice, so we put one in each triangle. Now we have this word poetry at the end. Unlike this sentence up here, where there was a separate direct object for each verb, he wrote the plays and he composed the sonnets. In this case, the students wrote and recited poetry. So they both wrote the poetry and they recited it. But it doesn't say the word poetry twice. If it said they wrote poetry and recited poetry, it would sound a little bit more wordy, and we would diagram it like we did up here. But it only says the word poetry once, so we only put it in our diagram once. That means they have a shared direct object. To do that, we join our verb lines back together and then add our single direct object here, poetry. So they wrote and recited poetry. And then we add our article adjective the under boys right here. When it seems to apply to more than one word, you put it with the first word you get to. The kind of goes for both the boys and the girls, but it only says it once, so we just put it under boys. If it said the boys and the girls, we would have written it down twice. And that's how you do compound parts in a sentence. Now, a new element learned in lesson 41 and 44 for 6th grade and 39 and 41 for 7th grade are called predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives. These are used with linking verbs. It's important that you make sure you know how to recognize your linking verbs, and if that's something you're unfamiliar with, your books have charts to help you memorize your linking verbs. Linking verbs show a state of being rather than an action. Up until now, we've been focusing on action verbs, and actions can have direct objects. Linking verbs, instead of direct objects, have predicate nominatives or predicate adjectives. They are diagrammed slightly differently. Instead of a straight up and down line like we use for direct objects, we have a slanted line. You may recall that predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives rename or describe the subject. So you can think of this line like it's pointing back to the subject. And then the simple predicate is always going to be a linking verb when it has a predicate nominative or predicate adjective. Let's look at this first sentence. It also has a compound part to continue reviewing our compound elements. Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates were ancient philosophers. Here we have the linking verb were. Now, were can be a helping verb as well, so to make sure you don't have a helping verb, look at what's right after it. If there is another verb after it, you might have a helping verb, but in this case we have ancient. Ancient's not a verb, so we know we just have a linking verb were. Then we have three different people who were ancient philosophers, so we need to split our line to have three subjects. Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. And then we put that conjunction inside that little triangle we formed. Now we see if there's a predicate nominative or predicate adjective. After were, we have this noun, philosophers. Philosophers means the same thing as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. They were philosophers. Philosophers then is a noun renaming those three people. We put philosophers here. And notice that we used an angled line because it's a predicate nominative. A predicate nominative is any noun that means the same thing as the subject and comes after a linking verb. And then ancient is an adjective describing philosophers. Let's look at another sentence. Aristotle will become the father of logic. In this case, we have the linking verb become, and the helping verb that goes with it will. So our simple predicate is will become. Become isn't an action you take, it's something you are, it's a state of being. So we don't have an action verb, we have a linking verb. And we ask who will become to find our subject, Aristotle. And then we look for what comes after our verb. He will become father of logic. So he will become the father. That would be our predicate nominative. It is a noun that means the same thing as the subject. In this case, not a literal father, but a figurative father, the leader of logic per se. So we have the under father, and of logic tells us what kind of father. So it's a prepositional phrase describing father. Okay, and that's what our diagram looks like. So the only difference between a direct object and a predicate nominative or predicate adjective is the angled line pointing back to the subject. Let's look at one more. The food from the market smelled delicious. Smelled is one of the words that can be a linking verb or an action verb depending on how it's used in the sentence. If something is doing the word smelled as an action, it's an action verb, but if it is expressing how something smelled, it's a state of being. It says the food from the market smelled delicious. The food, not going around smelling something in the market, so we have a linking verb. It's telling us how the food smelled, but the food doesn't have to do anything. The food is just being this way. So food is our subject. Smelled is our verb. And delicious is a predicate adjective describing the food. So delicious is like an adjective. We could have said, the sentence could have said the delicious food and then told us something about it. But in this case, it's a predicate adjective. A predicate adjective comes after a linking verb, but describes the subject. So here is our linking verb smelled, followed by this adjective delicious, but it actually goes back and describes this word from earlier. Now we add in our regular adjectives that come before our nouns, the food, and then it was also food from the market. So we're going to add our prepositional phrase from under food. From the market tells us what kind of food it was. market, and then the describes the market. And that's how you add in predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives. Now we're going to go over one more element in this video called an appositive. Appositives, you may remember, rename something. It's going to come right after a noun and give more information about it by renaming it in some way. To diagram an appositive, it goes in parentheses right after the noun it renames. Both the noun it's renaming and the appositive itself can have adjectives, and you need to put them under the appropriate part of the line. So if the word is describing this noun, it needs to be visibly underneath that word. If the adjective is describing the appositive, it needs to be visibly underneath that section of the line. So we're going to look at two different sentences to see how this works. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, delivered the Gettysburg Address. So always look for your verb first. What happened? He delivered something. He gave this speech. And then we ask who delivered the Gettysburg Address? Abraham Lincoln. However, we have this phrase, the 16th President of the United States, which is a noun phrase that gives us more information about who Abraham Lincoln was. That's our appositive phrase. It's always going to come right after the noun and immediately rename it without any verbs. So we have Abraham Lincoln we keep that together because it's all his name. It's not an adjective and a noun. And then in parentheses, we put the noun from the appositive. So that would be president. Abraham Lincoln and president are the same person. We put president in parentheses. And then our verb, delivered. We're going to come back to the rest of the phrase in just a minute. Let's stay on this horizontal line. He delivered what? He delivered the Gettysburg Address. We have Gettysburg Address on our horizontal line here. And the modifies it. Now let's take another look at that appositive phrase. President is our noun. That's all that goes in parentheses. The other words describe it. So he was the president. He was a 16th president. And then he was president of the United States, not president of somewhere else, but of the United States, which is a prepositional phrase. We put of on our slanted line. Our object of the preposition is United States. And the modifies United States. So you can see how we have a phrase that renames a noun. We put just the noun in parentheses here. These adjectives all appear under this section of the line. They are not describing Abraham Lincoln. They are describing the word president, so they have to appear here. Now let's look at a second example. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle was a student of Plato. Here we have a linking verb, was. It's a state of being. The philosopher was a student. Our subject is going to be philosopher. The ancient Greek philosopher was a student of Plato. And then Aristotle is our appositive. The subject is always whichever one came first, and the appositive is whichever one came second. So if this sentence had instead said Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, that would have been a different sentence and we would diagram it differently. So our subject is whichever noun comes first, and our appositive is whichever noun comes second. So in this case, we'd put philosopher, and then in parentheses, Aristotle. That is our subject, and then our verb was. And then was is a linking verb, so we look for those predicate nominatives or predicate adjectives. In this case, we have a predicate nominative, student. The philosopher was a student. Student and philosopher are the same person, so we have a predicate nominative. Now let's return to all of our adjectives. Here, it was the ancient Greek philosopher. It's not describing Aristotle, it's describing the philosopher. It's not the ancient Aristotle or the Greek Aristotle. So we put those words under the philosopher section of the line. The ancient Greek are all telling us more information about the word philosopher, but there's no adjectives that go with Aristotle. And then we have A is describing the student, and of Plato tells us what kind of student he was. We put of, our preposition, on our slanted line, and Plato, our object of the preposition, on the horizontal line. So that is a few more elements of diagramming. There is still more to come. It continues to get more complex, but you now have the basics of these new elements.